This is the Middle-earth Philosopher. So I want to start this video out with a disclaimer here, that it's not meant to be controversial or make any kind of ideological or political points, or promote said points. It is simply for discussion and observation of this particular topic in Tolkien's universe only. That said, when I first saw the Two Towers and then later on Return of the Kings and the Double O's, one of the things that immediately struck me was the relationship between Frodo and Sam. More specifically, and in case you haven't guessed where this is going, how it seemed that they play out like in a romantic relationship than it did as close friends supporting each other on a quest. And I know for a fact that it wasn't just me that was thinking this. That Frodo and Sam seemed to be, or were implied to be, gay lovers was somehow becoming something of a meme during that time when the movies were being referred to, even becoming something of a joke in Kevin Smith's Clerks 2, when Randall, being the Star Wars fan, gets into an argument with the Lord of the Rings fan over which trilogy was the greatest. And please feel free to comment below in your opinion on that, because that will probably be just as equally funny. That said, Randall, being the asshole that he is, drops that particular bomb on the Lord of the Rings fans, and they particularly lose their shit as he really begins to lay into it. And I'm not going to go into detail about how he does that, because it's just fucking bad. But that being said, the irony being that, funny as it was, it also wasn't too far from the truth. As great as the Lord of the Rings trilogy was and still is, that is one aspect I've seen a lot of from fans of either the books or the movies, or both, that tend to either agree or intensely disagree on. And I'm sorry to say that I've gotten into one or two of those disputes myself. Now look, objectively, I don't really care if the hobbits were gay or not, no matter the media. I really don't give a fuck. I really don't care. Rather, the oddness to me had nothing to do with, oh my god, they made Frodo gay, and more to do with, why are they making this relationship different from the other ones in the movies? Which then led me to this particular question. What is love in Middle-earth? What is it supposed to be? The reason behind this question, or questions, is that the word love is thrown around quite a bit between male characters. And while there's no specific gay relationships mentioned or implied, as far as I know at least, in any of Tolkien's writings, at least the ones that I've read, at the same time, many fans tend to take it there because of the fact that love is thrown around to each other between male characters, and that every so often, short of anything sexual, they tend to display certain actions that seem to almost imply that. Now, number one, before I read any of the books or saw the movies, my first exposure to anything Tolkien related was Rankin Bass's Lord of the Rings Return of the King cartoon that my dad used to get me when I was living in the city. And while I recognize that that wasn't a point-for-point exact copy of the books either, Frodo and Sam's portrayal seemed less emotional. Not a lot of vulnerability there, even though it was also a desperate situation. Also, I was pretty much focused on that funny tune about where there's a will, there's a way by the Orcs. If you know what I'm talking about, you're in the know. But having said that when you compare in the 2000s movies the relationship between the characters, such as Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas, who seem to have the more traditional bros relationship, the differences seem even that much more clear. I remember watching the behind the scenes videos afterwards when the DVDs came out for the extended editions, and Ian McKellen, the actor who plays Gandalf, saying that for his portrayal of Gandalf's relationship with Theoden in Two Towers, that in the scene where he gently touches Theoden's hand was something he drew upon gay relationships, and that was a very common theme. Now, years later, when I read the Silmarillion for the first time, this question again comes up when several of the characters of the same sex, even if different species, start expressing love, quote unquote, for each other. As I've said in my previous video on treachery, that it seems that the ultimate ideal of Middle-earth existence is one of brotherhood, of which treachery was the polar opposite. In brotherhood, you have characters typically depicted as male, for a long time developing such close-knit and tight bonds, oftentimes under great fire or duress, that their connections began to exceed that of normal friendships and arguably even family relationships. And if we're being honest, this is a depiction of male relationships that we see in the media until I want to say maybe the 2010s. That male relationships can show emotions such as fear, crying, great sadness, and so on, but only when in relations to war, great loss, or some sense of brotherhood. Nothing ever really, I guess you could say, romantic or emotionally vulnerable for the sake of just being vulnerable, I guess. This is the Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli relationship, that of brotherhood under duress. And this is also the definition that I've seen many fans and scholars who dispute the movie's portrayals usually fall back to. That Frodo and Sam are not gay lovers or anything approaching that, but rather, I guess you can say, are following some sort of higher level of love, one of brotherhood that was forged under great duress of the quest for destroying the One Ring. Also, too, that I've heard mentioned is that because Tolkien was Catholic, that being a stereotypical hyperconservative, and again I emphasize stereotypical, that there would be no way in hell that he would promote such actions in his writings, at least openly. Yet, as I just mentioned before, other examples within the Legendarium seem to contradict this. Take Maedhros' relationship with Fingon, whom, while directly in the text spoken as a close friendship, oftentimes seems to be implied more than that, or at least interpreted that way by many fans. Or, even more so, the relationship between Turin Turambar, High King Thingol, and Beleg, whom, despite being of different races, because Thingol and Beleg were elves and Turin was human, and that they openly say, the elves, that they loved Turin. Maybe Thingol could get away with that since he openly says that Turin was an adopted son to him, basically. But what about Beleg? Yes, it says that they were friends, but Beleg doesn't display anywhere near the same loyalty to anyone else, with the exception of his king, that he does to Turin, to the point of basically giving his life for him. Of course, one cannot argue this without taking into account the cultural lenses of the times as well, which is another fallback. Yes, you can argue Tolkien was a product of his era, but then again, so are we. I cannot begin to count the numerous ships of male characters in romantic relationships in other franchises that I've seen, despite the fact that nothing of the sort was mentioned or hinted at in the actual show or writings. People just wanted to see that. So, going back to Middle-earth and Tolkien in his era, I don't think this particular argument is quite as clear-cut. As it turns out, Tolkien is documented to be quite into the writings of one of his students, Mary, I want to say Renault, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, in which he says that, quote, I was recently deeply engaged in the books of Mary Renault, especially the two about Theseus, the king must die, and the bull from the sea. A few days ago, I actually received a card of appreciation from her. Perhaps this piece of fan mail that gives me the most pleasure. This is from Tolkien's letter, number 294. Now, for those of you who know anything about those particular writings, those are about male relationships. They're quite openly and clear-cut gay. Simple as that. Also, too, another author, Iris Murdoch, who was openly bisexual and was a devoted fan of Tolkien's, has also said that Tolkien oftentimes encouraged her writings, even though she also, too, openly writes about gay relationships in her work, and that Tolkien also, too, encouraged her and other female writers to reject using male pseudonym names that was common for the time. So, taking these two factors into account, it looks like the go-to of Tolkien being a product of his time isn't entirely watertight either. Tolkien still had his religious views, and they did play out in his Middle-earth writings, but also seems perhaps that he was much more progressive about them as well, if he was willing to entertain the idea and encourage others to entertain the idea in their works as well. So, taking all this into account, what does this mean for love in Middle-earth? What is it? Well, I suppose it means that basically there's a gray area. Again, there's no openly gay relationships in Middle-earth at all that are mentioned that Tolkien writes in any of his writings. And even the movies tend to acknowledge this, as Peter Jackson has been quoted as saying that he wanted to keep any modern interpretations out of the production of the actual movie, much to the studio and some actors' dismay, mind you. And Sam is also shown having great love for Rosie Cotton, and no romantic tension existed between those characters of any kind. But at the same time, that a more affectionate, feminine, if you will, expression of love is also shown by the male characters in the lengths that they go to for each other, and in some cases mentioning, particularly at the end of Return of the King, that they had great love for each other as well. I suppose that you could say that love in Middle-earth is an affectionate bond of deep and intense meaning between people that expresses itself in many ways, and that in many ways is similar to taking an oath, but where one is more official and political, whereas the other is chosen, deeper and more profound. Or, as Elrond puts it,
the ring-bearer is setting out on the quest of Mount Doom. On you who travel with him, no oath nor bond is laid to go further than you will. Farewell. Hold to your purpose. May the blessings of elves and men and all free folk go with you.
The Fellowship awaits the ring-bearer.